Hello, I'm Louise Mirror, New York Historical's President and CEO, and I am thrilled to introduce this special program, A Conversation with David Blight, The Spirit of Democracy. This program is presented as a part of New York Historical's inaugural Lapham's Quarterly series. Just before I introduce our speakers, I want to express our gratitude to President and CEO Alberto Ibargüen and the Knight Foundation, whose generous support has made tonight's conversation possible. Now then, we are pleased to welcome David Blight back to our virtual stage. He's a New York Historical Trustee, the Sterling Professor of American History, and Director of the Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery, Resistance, and Abolition at Yale University. Professor Blight is the author or editor of many books, including Frederick Douglass, Prophet of Freedom, for which he won numerous awards, including the Pulitzer Prize in History and the Gilder Lehrman Lincoln Prize. We are also thrilled to welcome Louis H. Lapham to our virtual stage as moderator for this evening's program. Mr. Lapham, a member of the American Society of Magazine Editors Hall of Fame, has served as the editor and founder of Lapham's Quarterly since 2007. He was editor of Harper's Magazine from 1975 to 2006, and he is the host of the podcast, The World in Time. His documentary film, The American Ruling Class, has become part of the curriculum in many of our nation's schools and colleges. Now, I am happy indeed to turn the stage over to our speakers. Thank you.
David, thanks for joining me in a conversation on democracy.
Well, Louis, thank you for having me, and thanks also to the New York Historical Society.
In your various writings over the last year, David, for The Atlantic and the New York Times, you say that the combination of the COVID epidemic and the 2020 presidential election has shown us that our democratic society and political system are institutionally broken. But instead of bemoaning the fact, you side with Abraham Lincoln, confronting similar circumstances in December 1862, 1 month before signing the Emancipation Proclamation, saying to Congress, "We can succeed only by concert. It is not, can any of us imagine better, but can we all do better? As our case is new, so we must think anew and act anew. We must disenthrall ourselves, and then we shall save our country." And if I read you correctly, David, that's what you're saying, that instead of a cause for despair, we've been given the best chance in 2 generations to renew the meaning of what Walt Whitman called the great word democracy, to take up what you call the historic task of national rebirth. But we find ourselves in both the worst of times and the best of times. What is the first step in the forward direction?
I guess the first thing that Americans have to do in this time of, let's face it, despair over particularly the COVID epidemic, is to admit what has happened to us, to face the fact that we have numerous broken institutions. We can begin to name them if we want. Perhaps we'll discuss this. We have to first face the fact that nothing about democracy, nothing about the American Republic is necessarily permanent. It is not something born at a time in history that will live forever, by any means. And it is right now being tested whether this kind of democracy, I guess this is what Lincoln said too, didn't he, in the Gettysburg Address, testing whether this kind of government, this kind of pluralistic democracy can actually endure. And it's not enduring very well for a whole host of reasons. But we have to first face the fact that we are broken institutionally. We may even be broken as a society, our social bonds. The problem is that democracy demands of us more often than our selfish humanity allows. democracy demands of us to give up something, to give ourselves to our fellow citizens in certain ways, to collaborate with our fellow citizens, and to not crawl off into our own individualism and crawl off into our own selfishness. That's not easy to do. Democracy, in that sense, almost challenge, if not violates, human nature. It's asking of us something we're not very good at. But right now, we're being challenged. Can we actually repair this broken social fabric, this broken public health system, this broken political system that barely survived an election? And can we repair numerous broken institutions, from public schools to the United States Congress to a host of other institutions? I think we first have to face ourselves and admit that nothing about this experiment we're living has ever been permanent, and it's not right now.
Democracy is difficult.
Yeah.
You have to give it up. You have to, live for others, not the opinion of others.
Right. It's a shared liberty.
Yeah.
It's a shared polity. It's a shared consent. It's an old-fashioned idea that democracy is based on the doctrine of consent. I give consent to those leaders to lead me in that institution. But if I don't give that consent, and I resent all those institutions, and I come to believe that they don't serve me at all, then democracy is in deep trouble.
But it gets harder to do as the population increases and the size of government scales up. I mean, even somebody like Wilson said in his treatise on democracy in the late 19th century that it really comes down to a small group of people at the top.
Mm-hmm.
Rousseau says the same kind of thing. Rousseau says democracy, in the strictest terms, doesn't exist because it has to come down to a group of people.
Yeah.
And how do you do that? I mean, when we found a republic, it's a small population, relatively few people have the vote.
Yeah.
And Madison says that government should be run by people who have the wisdom to discern and the virtue to pursue the common good of society. Right? Yeah. But where do we find those people?
Well, we find them by, first of all, training them. We find them through, we hope we find them through humanistic and scientific education. We hope we find them through, of course, the political process. But, to a degree, you're right that pure democracy never has existed. It takes structure. It takes a republic, meaning representative government. There really is no functioning democracy that doesn't function within a structure of laws.
That's right.
Structure of rules, a structure of norms. We've been hearing a lot about that of late because so many rules and norms, and indeed even laws, have just been crushed or pushed aside by the very institutions sometimes that are supposed to be enforcing them. Finding great leadership, the philosopher kings is of course everyone's great wish, and every now and then as a teacher, I just had this experience the other day in my seminar. It was our last class. It was this incredible array of quite typical Yale undergraduates, about 15 of them, in a seminar on the life and writings of Frederick Douglass, and they were all making their final presentations, and then we all went around the room and had a sort of a final say. And I couldn't help asking at least two of them when they finished with their final say. I said, all right, what office are you running for in 10 years? Because I want to make sure I'm here to vote for you. Because some of these kids, they're just full of a kind of a civic spirit. They want to take ideas and go change the world. Some of them will get corrupted and they'll I don't know, they'll take a job in finance or they'll do whatever they do. And they might go change the world by taking a job in finance too. Who knows? But you can see in some of these kids that potential to transfer ideas into political leadership, whether the system will welcome them, whether they'll find their way in at the bottom levels, whether they'll even be interested in politics in 5 years is another question. But this is where today's politics is so complicated, isn't it, Louis? We live in a political culture now where for at least 30 to 40 years, part of our political culture has taught people to resent elites, to resent expertise, to despise and resent universities, media elites, corporate elites, because they don't seem to be producing, they don't seem to be performing, or in the view of some, they've become too ideological. But if we ever lose faith in this idea of expertise on some level, I mean, after all, what do we have universities for? What do we have scientists for? We've got these companies now, which are private sector, but full of people trained in our universities who are finding vaccines and creating miracles, it seems, or practically, in a time frame nobody believed possible. Those people didn't just appear. They were trained. Many of them are probably products of 30 years of training and practice and postdoc fellowships here and postdoc fellowships there. That's called expertise, and thank God we have it. Universities exist to create knowledge and to teach. And sometimes we do it badly, and sometimes we're our own worst enemies, and sometimes we are an easy target for the right-wing people who think we're nothing but a bunch of foolish, left-wing ideological elites, which we're not, by and large. But, this idea of leadership is an important thing. You can have democracy and still have trained leadership. The two,
yes,
hand in glove. They have to go hand in glove.
Well, when Yale was founded in 1701, the object was to train preachers and magistrates, people who could contribute to the community and to build the structure of law.
Right.
And you can probably quote this. I can't, but the same ideas in Jefferson's mind when he starts the University of Virginia.
Sure.
Again, we're trying to produce mindful citizens.
Right.
And for a public good. But we've lost that idea in education. So maybe one of the first steps would be to rethink or recalibrate what is the purpose of an education.
Well, indeed. And we've been recalibrating that, though, for generations, haven't we? Let's think about that a second. I personally think that on the short list of all the things we have to address in this society now, whether it comes from the Biden administration or from elsewhere, is the idea of public education. And public education. Now, I have the privilege to teach here in a famous private university. But let's remember, first of all, only about 47% of Americans ever attend higher education.
Right.
The slight majority of Americans do not go to college. And a large number of those who do go to community colleges. They're extremely important in how people get educated. And let's also remember that somewhere in the 80 to 85% go to public universities. I am completely a product of public schools as a kid in Michigan, and then public universities in the Midwest, and with the Michigan State as an undergraduate, Wisconsin to graduate school. Now, everybody knows now that great public universities have also become, in great part, the function of private donors. But nevertheless, the public school was one of the most, if not the most, democratizing institution in America in the 20th century. And I had the great good luck of being a product of that baby boomer generation. My father was a totally working class guy, grew up on farms, 4.5 years in the Army in World War II, comes out, becomes an auto worker. But it was possible for him in the 60s to manage to get 2 sons into a public university. That kind of class mobility was made possible by public education. But if we don't save and improve the public school in this country and then the public university, which is where most people get a higher education, we're in great trouble. In fact, it used to be the envy of the world, our higher education.
I know that. I come from California, and
Right.
I'm born in 1935, and in the 30s, the public school system in California was magnificent.
Yeah. Yeah. And the world envied our education systems. And then in post-World War II, they envied our higher education, our science education, and the world tried to model us, at least at that level. But we've increasingly made education the privilege of, wealth.
Yeah.
Those who have. Now, lots of universities and colleges have been doing heroic things to bring in the working class, to try to level this access, certainly through minority groups, Black students, brown students, and so on and so forth, through affirmative action programs of various kinds over the years. And they're still being practiced despite certain court rulings. But we've still got to find ways to lower the cost of this system of education, because it is absolutely at the center of American mobility. And it's this dream of, there are millions of Americans now, and this only begins to explain Trump voters, but there are millions of Americans who don't believe the American dream exists anymore. They really just don't believe that, okay, hard work ethic, have the right values, get an education, you'll be upwardly mobile. That's just not true for millions of people. And they resent the systems that they believe are rigged against them. And a lot of us have spent our time in the recent few years wringing our hands over how can these people support this character in the White House? And sometimes that's a reasonable question, I must say. But we forget that a lot of the people out there who have voted for him, 72 million of them, believe the system is broken, is rigged against them. And I don't know, they just saw this guy as some kind of plutocrat who would blow it all up, and maybe something better would come out of it. Now, that's not apologetics for, the millions of Trump voters or whomever, but it does begin, I think, with this faith or lack of faith that education is the path to mobility in this country, especially class mobility and racial mobility. There are many other institutions that have to be reformed and rebuilt and reimagined in our political system, in our economic system, and many other ways. But I think it's got to start with education.
But the way to start with it, of course, would be to fund it more generously. In other words, so schools can afford to hire good teachers, pay teachers a living wage, but concentrate less on the country club facilities.
Yeah, well, we're not improving American democracy. I mean, I understand why they're all doing it, but we're not improving American democracy by putting, Midtown Manhattan style fitness gyms in the center of every university and college campus, and for that matter, every private school. But back to this democracy issue, Louis, I mean, you've been writing about this and thinking about this for years. Don't we have, or am I just being rhetorical, but don't we have a really serious class problem in this country that we have not, frankly, perhaps ever found an effective way to truly address or to talk about? We love to believe that all boats will rise. You know, if the economy rises, all boats will, if the stock market rises, all the boats will rise. If the economy rises, boats will rise. Yes and no. It depends on which boat you're in. And we do have massive inequality now that is partly racial, make no mistake, but it's also class inequality. There are just a great number of people in this country who do not believe they have access to any kind of real mobility, and they're trapped and mired, if they're employed right now, in service economies that have no future. If we don't learn how to address that, and frankly, in our politics, I think if the Democratic Party doesn't figure out soon how to address that with real economic policies, not rhetoric, real economic policies, they're going to be in trouble, because a lot of the working classes, contrary to the times when you or I were growing up, has gone over to the Republican Party.
Yes, and we also, I mean, we have, for the last 40 years, starting with Reagan, ending with Trump, governments of the rich, by the rich, and for the rich. I mean, that was Reagan, but that was also Clinton, and that was also Bush. And the laws in Congress, more laws restricting the freedom of purpose of persons, and relieving the restrictions on property.
Uh-huh.
I mean, we've had a class system since the beginning.
Yeah.
I mean, at Yale in the 18th century, kids were ranked, their class ranking was according to the net worth of their father.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
That's right. Also, the cotillions in Philadelphia, colonial Philadelphia, the British officers
Uh-huh.
would dance first with the lady of the most net worth and so forth down the dance floor. That's the way that was set up. I mean, we have,
Yeah.
all men are created equal in the eyes of God, but not in the
Yeah.
plantation of Jefferson or in the church pews in Boston.
Mm-hmm.
But we don't want to recognize this. I mean, we have had certain periods in the history of the United States where the democratic idea has, and the barriers of social mobility have been opened in the 1840s,
Mm-hmm.
50s, and again in the 1930s, 40s, and coming out of the New Deal. I'm old enough to remember what that was like. I mean, I'm again born in 1935 and raised in the 40s in San Francisco, and the democratic idea is alive and well. I mean, it's and the disparity between what the top executive was being paid as opposed to what the worker was going to be being paid was small. I mean, not like the way it is now.
Well, let's talk about some classical ideas here. The social contract.
Yeah.
You know, it's not something, I mean, we do talk about it, but we don't always call it that. Do we have a bond between each other as citizens? You know, what do I owe you as a fellow citizen? What does the government owe us, and what do we owe our government? That, you know, that's where the social contract is built.
Yeah.
And we've had periods in our history when the social contract really did get energized.
Yes.
The Civil War brought that about, with great blood and sacrifice, of course, terrible blood and sacrifice, but it brought about emancipation. It brought about a certain democratizing of access to the economy. The progressive era brought some of that. The New Deal, certainly. The 60s, certainly, to some extent, because it was such an economic boom. But, you know, then we've had periods, we always have periods of great reaction where the social contract is put in great danger. Yeah. Where our politics appeals to our individualism. It appeals to our avarice. It appeals to our greed, you know, to our narcissism, and so on and so on. But what's at stake here is, since the subject here is always these days democracy, no democracy can truly survive and thrive without a healthy social contract. And that's a contract that is, of course, rooted in law, bound by structures, by laws. What is Social Security but a revolution in the social contract?
Right. Yeah.
The government created a system of old age insurance. And, now I'm old enough to get my Social Security check every month. And now I remember why my parents, who were products of the Great Depression, talked about these things as almost holy writ, because they grew up with it. And, and my dad was actually, born on farms. He was a rural Republican. Despite being a rural Republican who still voted Republican, he didn't live that long, but he still, he believed in government. He was a patriot. He was a veteran of the Army. He loved to take us to Washington, D.C. and show us all the federal infrastructure. He was a rural Republican who nevertheless believed in government because he grew up with this idea that, well, in his youth and early adulthood, the United States government had saved the economy and saved the world in World War II. After all, government seemed pretty important. But now, as you pointed out, since Reaganism, let's be honest here, the idea of government has been denigrated.
Right.
And both political parties raise money from the same sources of wealth because they have to. This is the way our politics works, and Citizens United in particular, where there are practically no rules whatsoever now on political contributions. I mean, God, look at the money that's being spent in Georgia over 2 Senate seats. Yeah. It's just unbelievable.
But also the idea in a society that money is the supreme good.
Yeah. And that wealth is a sign of virtue, right?
Well, the Puritans had that idea too.
Yeah. But don't we have institutions that, if we can allow ourselves some idealism for the moment, which is hard.
But you have to, because the only way to change the world is with idealism.
I agree.
Cynicism can run the world, but idealism changes the world.
Cynicism might get you through your day, but without idealism, you won't get through the year. But, we got institutions that really have to be reformed. The U.S. Senate. It's just not a democratic institution. The Electoral College has been a ridiculous institution, well, for, frankly, 2 centuries, but there it is. We've got all kinds of electoral institutions that are desperate need of reform. Now, they don't get reform because it's a political process through which you have to do it. Representation for the District of Columbia, and on and on and on. We've got we've got all kinds of the whole electoral system in this country, despite the fact that it worked this time, and that's the good news. The voter turnout in this past election is extraordinary. 66%. It's the highest in a century. It's not quite as high as it was in the late antebellum era, and most Americans don't know this. But the highest voter turnouts in American history were in the 1850s. The 52, 56, and 1860 elections, granted, women couldn't vote, but who's to say they wouldn't have? But the slavery question and everything that circled around it, they had 80% turnout in many states in a rural society. But a 66% turnout in this complicated society is amazing. So that's good news. That means there is still...
That means the democratic spirit is still alive. Well.
People have faith in voting. They actually do.
Yeah.
And we actually can thank Mr. Trump for that in part. I think he brought out both sides.
Yes.
Turns out. But that's the good news. But beneath that are institutions that are not very functional.
No,
they just aren't. The Congress is paralyzed. The Supreme Court is functioning but highly politicized, probably, more than ever, at least since the 1930s. And other elements of our political institutions are dysfunctional. And until we have, some people would say, a kind of constitutional revision, maybe we do need a new constitutional convention. The idea of having that is almost unthinkable right now. We can't even get a stimulus package out of the Congress. How are they ever going to devise a constitutional reform convention? They're not. But we've also got a structure right now that allowed an authoritarian populist to seize power.
Right.
A party system that you can call it a perfect storm if you want, perhaps, but Trumpism was not just some revelation that came out of
no. I mean,
it's been growing for years.
Yes, I mean, in 1989 at Yale, I went to Yale, and you're at Yale, so I speak fondly of Yale. But in 1989,
you're teaching me about this place. That's good.
No, I was a great friend of Giamatti. Was a
yeah.
And he worried about what was happening in Yale in the 80s because everybody wanted to go to Morgan Stanley. But
right.
In the kids' rooms in Yale in the 89, in the photos that they had on the walls of their heroes, in the 60s, the photo would be Dylan and Che Guevara, right?
Right.
In 1989 at Yale, the photos were Trump.
Really?
Yeah.
Donald Trump was on the walls of students?
Yes.
Oh, that's,
He was on the walls of the students, and he was on the cover of Time.
The model. He was a model.
Yeah, and he was on the cover of Playboy.
Yeah. So he was defeating the other New York Titans at their own games.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He was the ace of diamonds. I mean,
yeah.
Money is the hero with 1,000 faces.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that was,
I didn't know that.
That was the face of Trump.
Uh-huh. Well, there you are.
We got to get rid of the idea that money is the hero with 1,000 faces.
Yeah. Yeah.
We really do. I mean, the opposition between democracy and capitalism, they're both forces of revolutionary change.
Oh, yeah.
But they turn in opposite directions.
Yes.
Democracy turns toward the direction of the world fit for human beings.
Yes.
Capitalism turns a world fit for machines.
Yeah, and I wonder, Louis, how you think about this, because democracy, it seems to me, needs a history and a practice. It needs an experience of success.
Yeah.
In order for it to continue. People have to win and lose elections to believe in elections.
Yeah.
To have that kind of faith. You lose a couple of times, you realize, oh man, we better look at why we lost. And we can hate the people who beat us, but
yeah.
Well, behold, they beat us. And actually, they're both of those lessons in this election. I mean, Democrats can celebrate that Biden won, but they didn't. They lost seats in the House. They lost state legislatures. There's a lot of perilous messages out there in the way this vote went. A lot of perilous messages.
That's good.
Yeah, no, I agree.
Is argument by nature.
Yeah. And I think this is, I mean, it's always, historians are always complaining that people don't know enough history, but, that's our job. But, we've had these periods in our history when democracy got crushed or was in deep, deep crisis, and it caused tremendous conflict, sometimes great bloodshed, and out of it came a renewal.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not saying the American experiment is necessarily inherently this story of, it dies and then it's reborn. It dies and it's reborn. No one wants to wish for a civil war or a Great Depression. Nobody does. On the other hand, knowing that a second American republic, a whole second constitution, really came out of emancipation and the Civil War, knowing that the progressive era did create some legal regimes that began to at least tame industrialization, and then knowing that the New Deal, despite its flaws, nevertheless basically saved capitalism and began to at least democratize our politics. And then knowing at least that out of the tremendous turmoil of the 1960s came a kind of second reconstruction with civil rights acts and the Voting Rights Act and so on, and all the other rights movements that came out of that. Otherwise we think that somehow, all time is the present. It isn't. We've been here before.
Yeah.
And the more we can look back, historical parallels are never perfect, obviously, but they can be very, very useful. In fact, one of my great worries, or just a thought I've had over the last few years over and over and over again is, and again, not to be too partisan, but what if Donald Trump had been a much more clever and informed authoritarian populist? What if he really had studied history? What if he knew something about right-wing populism in this country? He'd have been much more dangerous.
Yes, he would have been.
He might have been much more clever. He might have used institutions more effectively. He wouldn't have just gotten rid of everybody who wasn't loyal, on and on and on and on and on. We almost have to be grateful he is so ignorant.
I am first in line in gratitude. Well, talking to you, David, is heartening, just the same way as reading what you write, because you give us the idea that an ending implies a new beginning, and we have a chance to make one. Mm-hmm. And it's the best chance I think we've had in 2 generations. And listening to you talk, I get a spring in my step.
Oh,
thank you, David, for joining me in this conversation.
I enjoyed it. Thank you, Louis.